on 938 Live. This is Talkback.
Over 170,000 Filipinos work in Singapore, many of them as domestic helpers, doing jobs that we don't want to do ourselves. They also contribute to our country in many other ways, as professionals, as shop assistants, healthcare workers, for instance. Now, this did not stop a group of netizens from posting or supporting xenophobic posts about the Filipino community on the blog Bloodstained Singapore. Now, Google, which owns Blogger, the hosting publishing service that was used, has taken down the blog. But how can xenophobia be dealt with at its core? Now, this was the second time this year that internet postings targeting the community made headlines. The first was when an online backlash occurred over a plan by the Filipino community to hold a Philippine Independence Day celebration in Orchard Road on June the 8th. The organizers, members of the Filipino Independence Day Council Singapore, also said they received anonymous phone calls demanding the event be cancelled. In an April 19th Facebook post, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said that he was appalled to read about those who had harassed the organizers. Other Singaporeans had come out to show their support for the organizers, saying that the criticism was xenophobic. They had wished them the best for their event. However, the organizers eventually dropped their plan, and for the first time in more than 20 years, the event was cancelled.
Now, more recently, Manpower Minister Tan Chuan Chin said he was glad that the blog Bloodstained Singapore had been removed. And he said when things posted online cross a line, we should not accept it. The minister explained on Facebook that this is not about the freedom of speech or a debate about immigration or foreign workforce policy. This is about racism and xenophobia, and there is no place for racists and xenophobes in our society. He said vile and vicious blogs like this do not reflect who we are as a people, and we should make a stand and call it out when we see it. So, would you take a stand? And if you do, how would you do it? How can the silent majority be encouraged to speak up against hate speech to better reflect the sentiments of Singapore society? And how can we communicate disagreement or a different viewpoint with more maturity? How can we better embrace diversity? Are you concerned about how much speech would affect our international reputation as well? And just as importantly, how do we see ourselves? Call us on 669-11938. You can start talking to us, of course, on Facebook, official 938 Live.
Joining us in the studio today, Dr. Carol Soon, a research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies. She's also the co-author of a report on corrosive speech. Good morning, Carol. Welcome in. Now, in your recent report, I believe it was done last year, you do make a distinction between corrosive speech and hate speech. Can you explain the differences?
Now, I think many of us are familiar with the term hate speech, right? It's commonly used in, say, Western democratic systems such as the US, UK, etc., basically to refer to speech that put people down based on their gender, religion, sexual orientation, or ethnicity. We felt that corrosive speech is more suitable for two reasons, right? Number one, it is wider in scope because we recognize that not all utterances are filled with hate, right, or have the intention to promote hate or rancor among different segments of the population. So that is one. So we wanted to capture the wide range of say racist or xenophobic speech, ranging from harmless utterances to all the way to the other spectrum, which could be, say, mobilization or galvanization of certain actions against to target certain groups. That's one. The other is when we talk about corrosive speech, we want to emphasize the consequences, right? What such speech may do to our society as a whole, how it could potentially can exacerbate tensions between different groups, and how it can cause misunderstanding and erode, say, social relations in the long run.
So in other words, corrosive speech can give rise to even more xenophobia in some cases, right?
Yes, if left unchecked. Yeah.
How would you classify the latest examples? Out and out hate speech?
I think we will just keep it as corrosive speech because really we don't know the intention of the person. So
unless they tell you, here's how you can target the Filipino community.
Well, arguably, I think the blog post has already done that in several ways. But it's currently under investigation. I think what we often don't hear is, say, the person's side of the story. What are some of the motives or some of the reasons behind such speech, such posts, for instance. So I think it will be good, if we can gain some insights into with that.
Right.
How exactly would that help? Because can anything really justify this type of communication?
Well, to be honest, people utter such speech for different reasons, right? Some do it on the spur of the moment. Okay, they're just frustrated, they're angry, maybe they suffered certain setbacks in life and they just wanted to air their thoughts. Others do it, literally for fun, and some do it to provoke. Correct?
But, to set up a website, I mean, it takes quite a bit of time to set up a website or a blog site. It's almost premeditated.
I mean, it's very easy to set one up. It takes a few seconds. But the intentions behind actually going all out to do it, that really does feel premeditated.
That's precisely some of the intentions behind trolls, right? Deliberately, provoking people, maybe gaining eyeballs as well. So there are different types of motivations, and it will be good, I think, for not just the targeted community, but Singaporeans at large to find out, what are the reasons or motivations that compel the person to set up such a blog and to post such articles.
Okay, before we talk about how those things can be surfaced better and how we can then turn that into more constructive discussions about the issue, based on your data, is such discourse actually increasing online?
Okay, now, I think the internet is such a vast space. It literally has no boundaries, right? So to put an actual quantity to it is almost an impossible task.
Right.
But based on our observation for the past 2 years, there are suggestions that people are becoming more vocal about how they feel, whether it's with regards to immigrants, specific populations, or immigration policies. I think a more important question to ask is not just how much, but also perhaps the tone, the tenor of such discourse. And what we clearly observe are two things, right? Number one, people are definitely more candid.
Right.
Okay, with their thoughts and sentiments. That's one. And number two, what is also heartening to see is in the past 1 to 2 years, bearing in mind we collected the data sometime in August, I think 2012, we do see more people stepping forward, okay, to denounce such actions or speech.
Right.
So anti-xenophobic movements, anti-racist movements as well.
Yeah, but I mean, some may not be movements, but at least we see more of these voices, independent voices.
So people are more willing to actually voice their concerns, about things in society in general. But the thing is, are they constructive? or how much of it is constructive and how much of it is destructive?
Okay, well, when we talk about dialogue, we always want to remember there's a whole range and whole spectrum, right?
Yeah.
It is not very realistic and, almost idealistic to only expect a certain kind of discourse.
Sure.
And also, let's remember that what exists online doesn't exist only in the online context. Very often, they are reflections of what's offline. Just because they are usually uttered in closed circles, we don't really get to hear of them, unlike in the online context
where it's amplified.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I see this form of dialogue as a process of a more maturing of a process of a maturing cyberspace. So I think as people engage more, okay, and we hear different voices from different sides, ultimately more positive norms will evolve.
But
You acknowledge there are cultural tensions between Singaporeans and non-Singaporeans. Adjustments have been made at the policy level for certain sectors. For instance, the government has tightened the inflow of foreign workers. However, if the unhappiness continues to exist, some might still feel there is no need for it to degenerate into xenophobic speech online or offline. Earlier you said we should find out what their reasons are. How? Not everyone can engage in a rational discussion about their motivations.
Yes, I mean, so for example, let's talk about, say, some of these cases, right, where the authorities are looking into. I think what would be good as part of closure is, besides the fact that the public is informed that it's undergoing, the case is undergoing investigation, or XYZ blogger has been warned, it would be good to know so-called the inside story and say to hear policymakers' responses to those, or VWOs or education institutions' responses to these things. So I think what we also highlighted in our paper is that I think we require different segments of the Singapore society to work together to so-called promote a more positive discourse with regards to immigration and migrants, for instance. So here we are talking about not just policymakers making a stand, but also other bodies such as whether it's education institutions or VWOs. So for example, we provided some case studies in our paper with regards to some racist comments being made in the context of the United Kingdom, right? So in that case, we see, say, Ofcom, which is an independent regulatory body stepping in. We see, say, the education institution, Swansea University, when one of its students tweeted racist tweets, stepping in. So we want to hear different voices from different segments of the population. And that way we are sending a collective message.
Yeah. Once you find out what the motives of the xenophobe are, what next? What do you do with that information?
I think, number one, that will help probably with bodies, whether it's the National Integration Council or other relevant organizations, to maybe it helps them better fine-tune, right, their strategies or integration programs, etc. But I think very importantly, it helps the general public, acquire a greater sense of understanding or empathy for why, people say the things that they say. And perhaps it can also be useful feedback to policymakers at large.
You talked about the maturing space, but what about the maturing society? Do you think society has matured in the sort of remarks that you see online?
I think the process is going to be a long drawn one, and we are basically quite a young society, right? And let's remember that racist speech, xenophobic speech, do not exist only in Singapore, but in many developing and developed countries as well. So it is a never-ending process. That said, I think, like I mentioned earlier, we do see, more positive voices, more instances of people, netizens coming forward to articulate a few things, right? Number one, they denounce, say, the actions or the specific offensive speech. Number two, we do see assertions made by these people that such actions come from a minority or a small segment of Singaporeans. And finally, we do see some people coming forward as well to reaffirm that, by and large, Singapore is still a very open and welcoming society.
Are Singaporeans perhaps unprepared for some of the freedoms available online? I mean, I don't want to talk about how we can get the silent majority to also speak up, but you mentioned low media literacy in your paper as well. Can you explain that?
I think this whole Web 2.0 phenomenon or internet phenomenon is new to everybody, right? Not just children, teenagers, but adults as well. If you can look at the past 2 years, the kind of faux pas that have been made by educated adults. By and large, I think there much more can be done to educate people on, say, certain inherent characteristics of the web. One common misconception, and this I've heard from different segments of the population, is, when I go on social media, when I go onto my blog, it's my space. It is my private account. I'm just airing my personal sentiments about certain issues. It's not meant, to stir up trouble, etc. But what people generally don't understand is that there is really no such thing as a private space in a public space like the internet. What you think is private is usually not private at all.
Yeah, and then there are others who really do want to get the word out there and publicize some of these xenophobic statements and sentiments, bigoted statements as well. We'll continue talking about this in just a moment, including how media literacy can be increased and how the silent majority can be encouraged to step up more. Stay with us on 938 Live, and you can call us as well, 669-11938. We'll talk to you right after news and sports. Thanks for joining us on Talkback on 938 Live. I'm Bharati Jagdish with Andre Achak. How can xenophobia be dealt with at its core? Now, over 170,000 Filipinos work here, many of them as domestic helpers doing jobs that we don't want to do ourselves. This did not stop a group of netizens from posting or supporting xenophobic posts about the community on the blog Bloodstained Singapore. How can the silent majority be encouraged to speak up against hate speech to better reflect the sentiments of Singapore society society? Would you publicly take a stand against it? How can we communicate disagreement or a different viewpoint with greater maturity? You can call us on 669-11938. Joining us today also in the studio is Dr. Carol Soon. She's a research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies and co-author of a report on corrosive speech, What Can Be Done? Now, Carol, earlier we talked about the level of media literacy. How do you think media literacy can be increased?
Well, if we talk about the dissemination of information, currently, I think a fair bit of work is being done in schools, right, to educate students on how they can react to, say, cyberbullying, etc. I think more can be done to tell them, say that more technical parts of cyberspace, but in a language that's appropriate for the students. That said, I think similar efforts should also be done, say, at the workforce, in organizations, and I think there are some private organizations that are already doing that with their employees. I think what needs to be driven home to people is the consequences of your speech online, right? Beyond other than consequences for the larger society at large, what is also important is to remind people of the consequences of their actions on their own lives, right? Because at the end of the day, like what I mentioned earlier, nothing is private anymore. Everything on the net would be permanent. So I think a useful reminder, which sounds really, really simple, is, do you want to be the next front page news? Okay?
And of course, some people do, and they would like what they say, even if it's xenophobic, to be permanent and to be publicized. And we'll talk about those people in just a while. Citizens should also feel free to express their views, even if those views are unpopular, right? I mean, this should not be about stifling the freedom of speech, but about actually promoting mature debate, constructive debate about the issues, right?
Yes, I mean, but of course, it's an ongoing learning process, right? We don't know. I think it's not realistic to expect people to so-called speak in a rational, balanced way
all the time.
To be honest, this internet phenomena is still relatively new. So I think people are, in a way, unaccustomed to the amount of freedom and liberty they have when they go online. And another point I want to make about media literacy is, beside educating people or informing them, what to consider when they post content, I think it's also important to inform people how they can or should react to, say, offensive posts, whether it's about other races or nationalities or any other thing, right?
Because there are several approaches. You
Correct.
could ignore it.
You could ignore it, is right. I mean, there have been academic research done where researchers look at forums and discussion boards, and they look at people's coping mechanisms in these forums. And sometimes they realize if you ignore trolls, for instance, the trolls will go away, right? So ignoring is one strategy. If not, you can report. Most sites have moderating policies, right, where you can report an offensive post.
That's right.
Where the moderator will then step in because you are flagging attention to a particular post, or you could leave.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
right. Okay, 669-11938. We have Lester on the line. Hi, Lester.
Hi, good morning.
Thank you for holding on.
Okay, actually, I was going to talk about ignoring, because I have many Filipino friends, and they were telling me how horrible the post, that blog was. I just told them that just ignore, because this is just a person, and that person, either he or she doesn't represent the whole lot of Singaporeans. And one point I want to make is, if we disagree with a certain article or post, we should not assist them by posting it or sharing it on either Facebook or other social media. Because by sharing it, we are actually helping that person to propagate his beliefs. We should make a stand, like maybe comment on his article or post, just make a strong stand, but not to assist to share it. That's what I feel.
Okay.
Okay, thank you
Thanks,
very much for
Lester.
that, Lester. Really appreciate it. Certainly, that shows some level of media literacy, doesn't it? How to cope with such things as well. We talked about ignoring it, not sharing it. What are some of the other approaches? Because you've also mentioned that we need more people perhaps to step up and be the voice of an anti-xenophobia movement, for instance, don't we? Get the silent majority to also speak up. But how to do it without giving these people more airtime, so to speak?
Well, I think as different government bodies, enhance their, say, integration programs, there will be better understanding, say, in the offline context, and this will spill over to the online context. Already we are seeing individuals and maybe groups of people on their own effort, on their own initiative, starting ground-up efforts to denounce certain actions. So these are positive signs. These are things that we should just encourage, right? And let people speak up for the things that they find offensive. I think Lester raised a very good point about not sharing, because at the end of the day, bad news sell. Right, and sometimes we get the impression that there's a lot of these negative content, but not necessarily so, because they are sticky. People tend to spread them, so it creates the illusion that they are pervasive when in fact they could jolly well not be.
Exactly.
Right.
It's amplified in an artificial manner, so to speak. Now, in Singapore, we do have laws for such things. For instance, a person who promotes feelings of ill will and hostility between different races or classes of the population could be convicted under the Sedition Act. They could be fined up to $5,000, jailed for up to 3 years, or both. And this has been invoked several times in the last few years as well. There's also the Internet Code of Practice. There are anti-harassment laws too, but laws are not enough, you say. So in terms of all these other approaches that we have talked about, how do you think they can be done more effectively? Information dissemination, public education was something that you mentioned earlier as well. How can that be actually done more effectively?
All right, before I go into that point, I think it's what you said about law is important, right? I just want to clarify something on that. Laws are important for two reasons, right? Number one, they provide people with avenues to seek legal recourse. And number two, they do set the moral tenor by setting standards for what's acceptable or not. But that say, law will have its limitations. It will never be able to keep up with the advancements in technology that will give rise to new kinds of behavior. So, soon we have to contend with privacy issues with new technologies such as Google Glass. With regards to how do we better enhance public information, I think, like I mentioned earlier, to do it at school and at the workplace, but also very importantly, I think for different stakeholders to continue articulate that, and maybe for mainstream media to continue to provide a platform for the airing of some of these issues, so that people do not always have to only go to online to be candid with their thoughts.
This is where the reasons, the motives of the xenophobes come into play, right? So a lot of them might actually have the wrong impression about government policy, for instance, and that's why they're angry. But if we knew why they were angry, you could then use that information to disseminate the right kind of information.
Correct. Right? So, for instance, earlier we talked about how some people may just recalcitrantly, hold on to the fact that, there are skewed HR policies in MNCs, etc. But if the data shows that there is not, these could be good takeaways for policymakers to know what kind of data to share more publicly to correct misconceptions.
Now, some bigots, some xenophobes might say, well, there have been criticisms of Singaporeans by foreigners here too. So why are we making such a big deal of Singaporeans criticizing foreigners? How would one deal with that in a more mature, intelligent manner?
I think, this boils down to integration issues, and integration being a two-way street, right? So I think clearly it points to more that can be done with regards to helping foreigners living in Singapore understand more about local cultures. And I think as we close the gap or the so-called effective distance between locals and foreigners, we will see less misunderstandings, and hopefully we will see a move from such discourse online.
And certainly you can make a choice about whether you want to have your comments degenerate to that level as well. Two wrongs don't make a right. Now, we've seen examples of Singaporeans speaking up against xenophobia. How can these voices be amplified? How can the silent majority be engaged to speak up more without also degenerating to that confrontational, aggressive level, or without using that same tone?
Or a polarizing position,
I think already we're seeing some of these. What would be useful is perhaps, which I think is being done, whether it's by policymakers or mainstream media, to highlight some of these positive initiatives. I think then people will take these as signposts. Okay,
right.
On what are some of the coping mechanisms and what are the sentiments of this other so-called silent majority.
But you see, the point is that sometimes it would help if your peers from the silent majority camp actually talk to you about this on that level, peer to peer, rather than, a top-down approach. What do you think we can do to perhaps encourage people in schools to air their views more, views that might be more rational, more moderate?
I think this is all part of the media literacy program. So currently, I think as part of the Global Internet Day, there is a lot of emphasis placed on being socially responsible online. How do you respect? How do you be ethical in your discourse? So I think there are programs in place to address some of these issues.
Now, we shouldn't just be careful of what we say and how we say it. What we think is important too, isn't it? So how can more perhaps be encouraged to embrace social diversity better, to understand the economic realities of our country, to understand why foreigners are here, and to embrace them as part of the fabric?
Yeah, I think clearly this is something that policymakers have tried to emphasize, and based on what we observe in the online space, we do see people recognizing such realities as well. So over time, hopefully, as maybe the current tweaks made by government policies to so-called give greater priority to Singaporeans, such policies may assuage some of the anxieties, and maybe in the long run we will see a shift away from such corrosive speech.
Thank you very much, Carol. Carol Soon from the Institute of Policy Studies. Now, there are several top-down initiatives, government initiatives. We've got the National Integration Council to promote integration, the Harmony Fund to support ground-up initiatives to promote racial and religious harmony. If you have ideas on how you can be a part of the solution here, do continue talking to us on Facebook, Official 938 Live. And many thanks for your phone calls today.